Just to introduce myself, my name is Burgess. I'm one of the partners in the employment team today. It's Simon Bellm, another partner in the employment team, and I, who are presenting this second session on the new working world. Before I talk to you about what we're going to cover today, just some housekeeping from our perspective. Many of you probably have already joined previous webinars of ours over the course of the last, well, it's been 13 months now we've been running them. So you may know the form, but for those who are new to it, we actively encourage you to raise questions during the course of the webinar. And to raise questions, can you do that in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens? If you have any technical problems, can you raise those in the chat function? Because then our team behind the scenes will respond to your technical issues. But yeah, the Q&A, please, for any questions you have which you want Simon or I to answer. And what we try and do is we'll try and run for about 50 minutes between Simon and I, saving that last 10 minutes up to 11 o'clock for dealing with your questions. Depending on how many we get, depends on how long that takes. The last session we ran, we had a lot of questions, about 12, 14 questions. We weren't able to get through all of them. That may be the same today. What we commit to do at every webinar is about a week, 10 days after the webinar, we'll publish both the recording of the webinar and also a Q&A document. So all the questions that are raised are then answered through the Q&A. So if we don't get to answer your question today, please make sure that you look out for the follow-up email from our team, which will answer your question. And of course, if you have specific questions that you want Simon, myself, or anyone in the team to answer for your business, then of course, do get in touch with us. Okay, so today we are running the second session of the new working world, is how we've framed it. Those of you who were at the first session, we looked at some of the implications in terms of vaccinations. We looked at a little bit at overseas working, and we looked also at some of the practical implications in terms of what you need to think about in your contract of employment as we move into the new working world. And what we deliberately didn't do in the first session is talk about what we're seeing in the marketplace for different working models. And many of you will be navigating your way through it. You'll be at different stages of your journey as to what models you may be looking at going forward. And I'm going to start the session today looking at some different models and what we're hearing from the government, and then what people are doing in practice. The legal and practical side is then going to be covered by Simon of these different models, and talking about informal and formal flexible working requests. And then I'm going to wrap up with looking at the broader impacts of new working models, which include considerations about your culture and your values, impacts on productivity, and also performance management, which is going to be touched upon towards the end there. Okay, so I think we're starting with a poll. Now, those of you who have attended before will know how the polls work, fairly self-explanatory. We will do two polls initially. So the first poll is this one. The question is this: will you be automatically allowing staff to work flexibly in the future? And the emphasis there is on the automatically. Will employees be able to just work flexibly, or will there be some rigor to your process? So is it yes, regardless of their role, they'll be allowed to automatically work flexibly? No, it will depend on their role. Or third option, still haven't decided. So if you can insert your answers. Probably as I expected. So 2/3 of you saying it's going to be dependent on the role, and 1/5 of you saying regardless of role, automatically your staff are going to be able to work flexibly. Okay, all right. Let's take this on to another question, which I think will be interesting for all of you on this webinar, because the question is this: how much of their working time will staff be allowed to work remotely? I think most employers are grappling with, how flexible they'll be, how much time. Is it complete flexibility, as much as they like? Is it 3 to 4 days, 1 to 2 days, or very little or none? You can again put your answers. Much of the talk in the press, I think, is around 2 to 3 working days on a hybrid type model. And that's what we're starting to see more and more from employers. It'd be interesting to see whether that bears reality from what you all say. Okay, so a third at 3 to 4 days. I might have expected that slightly higher, but the majority at the 1 to 2 days. Yeah, and as I say, I think most employers are looking at sort of 2 to 3 days in terms of their hybrid model. Of course, not everyone's going to be going for a hybrid model. Okay, thank you for that. So let's just move on and let's just talk through where we are in terms of the government's position, what the various reports are being published, and what some of the different employers are doing. So starting point was in March of this year when Liz Truss, the Minister for Women and Equalities, made a significant announcement. The starting point for which was the government say that flexible working should be normalised, and that could be part-time, flexi-time, working from home, or job shares. I mean, this has been talked about since 2019, in fact, by the government. So this is nothing new, this sort of movement towards normalising flexible working and making it easier and more acceptable for people to work flexibly. But of course, the events of the last 14 months have accelerated that. And the government produced some evidence on a report that they had commissioned, which showed that explicitly offering flexible working will increase applicants for jobs by 30%, and it leads to more opportunities for women and creates greater productivity outside major cities. And their report said that 9 out of 10 job seekers want increased flexibility, whether that's remote working or flexi time, some with reduced hours. So that was the government statement in March. Let's just backtrack from that and just think pre-pandemic. So 2019, there was a report produced by Aviva, which said that 22%, so about a quarter of people had actually moved jobs to try and get more flexibility in their working arrangements, albeit that half of the people in that report said that they felt awkward about discussing personal commitments with their line manager, and about a third said they're uncomfortable requesting flexible working. Well, the environment's changed, of course, now, and so one would expect that those figures would have changed. But that was the sort of pre-pandemic picture. And there was a 2020 report where the people that commissioned the report tried advertising all roles as flexible. So every single job advert that they used was advertised as a flexible working arrangement as an option. And it led to double the number of normal applications and 20% jump in women applying for senior roles, which fairly surprising in terms of the fact that it was double the number of normal applications. But it just shows the flexibility is very much expected. And then in this year, I mean, there's obviously lots of research going on now about flexible working and hybrid working models and so on. The Future Forum research, which is quite a well-known publication, said that 72% of people surveyed wanted a hybrid model of working. 12% only wanted to return 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, to an office. That probably doesn't surprise us that so few now want to be in the office all day, every day. And there's even support from senior business leaders as well. So the Institute of Directors survey this year showed that 74% of business leaders themselves said they would keep increased working from home hours themselves. And of course, one would expect that then to be the same for the people below them in their businesses. You may have picked up on this report last year from the CIPD, published in September, called Embedding New Ways of Working, Implications for the Post-Pandemic Workplace. Bit of a mouthful. So 28-page reports are quite detailed, and if you're looking at different models, there's lots of data and statistics in there. I'm just picking out a couple of points that struck me from it. So it said that pre-pandemic, 18% of the workforce had occasional work from home, with just 2% working mostly from home. And of course, the picture post-pandemic, according to CIPD's research, was that 40% of employers expect more than half of their workforce to work regularly from home. And none of the companies said their staff would be working from home full-time. I just want to look at one of the tables that was produced in that report, and it just shows the different approach, different sectors. So if I just sort of take through I suppose the key points, looking at the fourth line, which is all. So you've got a difference there between the voluntary, the private, and the public sector. And what this table shows is that before the pandemic, regular working from home across all sectors was 18% of staff were working regularly from home, whereas 9% were permanently working from home pre-pandemic. And you'll see that after the pandemic, in all sectors, it goes to 37% will be regularly working from home and 22% permanently working from home. And then it's interesting to see the different, if you break that down between the voluntary sector, the private sector, and the public sector, the most dramatic effects are in the voluntary and in the public sectors. The private sector was probably a little bit further, or it's more common maybe in the private sector, but certainly the jumps from the voluntary sector and the public sector are quite stark. And then the table also shows different sectors. So you'll see there that in business services sector, there's probably a doubling from the regular work from homes and the permanent work from homes pre and post. So it says that in the business services sector, from before the pandemic, there was 15% of business services staff working from home permanently, and that's going to double to a third. Seems quite high for it to be permanently working from home, but only 52% of those will be regularly working from home. So just some interesting stats. Production there, it also goes up quite dramatically, which presumably includes manufacturing, which one would assume is by definition harder to have flexible working and home working, but of course it depends on the role of the person in the business. There's plenty of tables in that report, and I do recommend it to you. So let's just think about what models we're seeing employers considering. Wide variety of things being talked about in the press. Fully flexible, output-based working, where staff are free to choose when and where and how they work. Haven't seen too much of that yet, but that will no doubt be a consideration for some businesses, particularly ones where they have the technology and they can deliver the outputs from the business with the technology they've got. We're seeing a lot of core hours and core days type models, which is sort of a flexi time type model. Talk about hybrid models where there's core days where people will go to the office, and that's their sort of collaboration time. And typically that might be the 2 or 3 days, core days, which will be worked in an office environment. And also we're seeing mixtures between virtual face-to-face meetings. Yes, we're all very much used now to the virtual meeting environment, but of course face-to-face meetings are equally important, and we're seeing a mixture between the two. Some are still taking the approach of it's only by exception that their staff will work from home. Again, that's business dependent, what they do. If they're manufacturing goods and they need to be in a factory to do that, then it makes sense that they would only be able to work from home by exception. Similarly, compulsory site working, again in that example, when you've got production staff, for example, and you would want them to be on site working. Now, I mentioned at the bottom there, flexibility in terms of location and overseas working. In our first webinar that we ran, we did touch upon overseas working, and off the back of that, we're going to run another webinar. Our next webinar, in fact, in June, is on overseas working. So I'm going to say nothing more about that other than we're seeing lots of companies getting requests from their staff to work overseas. And I'll talk to you at the end of this webinar about the next one we've got lined up, which will cover that. I thought I'd just share, I suppose, key points from an interview I read from the HR director, Group HR Director, Lena Lair of Unilever, what they're doing and what they've done over the past 12 months. So Unilever have 150,000 staff across 190 countries. Obviously, they've had to respond on a local level to the pandemic. Key lessons that they've learned in their business, obvious stuff, but care for your people and they'll make it a better business. Mental well-being, put that at the forefront. Well, we've all, I think, been doing that or trying to do that over the last 12 to 14 months. And what struck me was her final point that she sort of learned from the last year is don't miss this opportunity to think about reinventing the workplace, workforce, where and how to work, because this is the time that you can do it and you can remodel how you work and how your staff work flexibly. For them, returning to the office and returning to travel depends on the local situation, country by country, in terms of vaccine deployment and efficacy. And she was talking about their hybrid model, which is going to look at both the physical workspace, which is the office environment and creating more collaboration and connections, but also the digital workspace as well. Turning to the UK, so some of this is global, but looking at some of the UK stuff, well, picking out some of the banks, they're the ones that seem to have been mainly in the press about what they're going to do or not do, as the case may be. Slightly famously or infamously now, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, in a speech he gave in a conference a few months ago, described working from home as an aberration we're going to correct as soon as possible. Well, that may be right for them. We're not seeing much of that sort of messaging in, I suppose, the regional and the London working environments in our sort of typical SME type businesses. Lloyds, the bank, they've said that 77% of their huge workforce, and that would be the global workforce, have said they want to work from home for 3 or more days a week. So they're going to reduce their office footprint by about 20%, they're saying. Similarly, HSBC, 40% global reduction in their office space. And I think we're all working in our businesses with the facilities guys to think about the requirement in terms of office space and also what the environment will be like. HSBC themselves have said that 1,200 of their call centre staff, I think that's globally rather than just in the UK, are going to be permanently working from home. They've got the technology now to do that, and they're going to give £300 a year to cover expenses for heating, electricity, and so on. And the other thing that HSBC has been in the press for is making it clear that they're not allowing Zoom meetings on a Friday because of the reported Zoom fatigue that many of their staff are suffering. Jez Staley is the CEO of Barclays, who again recently has described home working as getting old. Again, maybe not quite as extreme as the Goldman Sachs CEO, but sort of the tenor is such that they will want people coming back into the office. And it'd be interesting to see how the city, and for Barclays, Canary Wharf in their case, how that changes and as a result of the pandemic. I just wanted to touch on something else which there's been various amounts of noise about, some in the UK, but certainly overseas as well. And that's this principle of moving to a 4-day week. So rather than obviously working a full-time person working 5 days, they would do their full-time hours over 4 days. And we've seen this in terms of flexible working requests, where an individual says they will compress their hours, so they do 4 long days and don't work on the 5th day. But we're seeing more noise about it in the sort of broader political environment. So the SNP, for example, in their manifesto for the recent elections, included a proposal for the Scottish Government to fund companies wanting to trial a 4-day working week. And it's something that in Spain, they've already started a pilot to work 32-hour weeks over 4 days. And the way the government funding works, or going to work in Spain, is that they will pick up some of the company's costs involved in trialling the move to a 4-day week. And there's a company in southern Spain called Software Del. They did and have introduced a 4-day working week, which led to reduced absenteeism, higher productivity, and a general better well-being score from their staff. In Japan, I read that Microsoft have given an extra day off each week to their 2,300 staff, and they're claiming a 40% productivity increase from their staff. Now, how these things are exactly scored and measured, I don't know, but that's sort of the headline number. So what are we doing in the UK? There's the commitment in Scotland I mentioned in terms of the SNP. There is an organisation called the 4-Day Working Week, which is appears to be a sort of foundation or a charity, and they've introduced an accreditation scheme whereby you can get a silver or gold accreditation depending on exactly how committed you are to the 4-day working week. And 15 organisations are published on their website which are doing a 4-day week. And what they're doing is they're doing a maximum 32 hours, no loss of pay for those people who are doing the 4-day week. And there's a mixture of businesses, engineering consultancies on there, cosmetics business, the housing association, design agencies. Not many businesses, but certainly some. But it's certainly something that we're hearing noises about, something that's been discussed in Germany as well, I know, and in various parts of Europe. Whether it's going to come through over the coming years in the UK, we'll wait and see. Okay, so that's me done for now. I'm going to pass over to Simon, who's going to talk you through some of the practical and legal issues. If you can keep any questions coming in, as I say, put that in the Q&A and in the chat function if you can raise any technical problems. Thanks. Thanks, Simon.
Thanks very much, Greg. Well, I think for a lot of organisations, we will be seeing change to the arrangements that exist at the moment. So I'm going to talk about some of the practical issues in terms of managing that change and some of the legal issues as well. So, I mean, the first situation that I'm going to look at is employees who are reluctant to return to the workplace. So we've had employees perhaps working from home for 18 months. They might be saying, well, I don't really want to return to work either full time, or I don't really want to return to the workplace at all. To what extent can an employer say, well, you've got to return to the workplace? The answer to that is you still need to take care. Quite often, the employer's objection will be put forward on the basis of health-related reasons. And for a long time, we've been looking at Section 44 and Section 100 of the Employment Rights Act, which are the provisions which prohibit an employer from subjecting an employee to detriment or dismissing them because they've refused to attend at work where they have a reasonable belief that that would place them in serious and imminent danger. And I think the situation in relation to COVID vaccines makes it very difficult for an employee to argue that they'll be placed in serious and imminent danger. were they to be required to return to work. So the risks there for employers are probably diminishing all the time. Employers are going to have to keep in mind that they've got their general health and safety related responsibilities to undertake risk assessments and to follow the COVID guidance. I think where the employer is saying, I don't want to return to work, if they are a vulnerable employee or a disabled employee, particular care needs to be taken. Obviously, in the case of disabled staff, you've got the requirement to make reasonable adjustments. So those decisions have to be taken carefully. If the employer is saying, well, I don't want to return to the workplace for other reasons, it might be related to childcare. Employer has probably got a stronger hand to say, well, no, we're now managing a return to work. There's potential of discrimination issues where the reasons are childcare related. If the employer is putting forward the fact that, well, it's inconvenient to travel to work, I don't like the commute, it costs me to commute, etc. Those are not particularly powerful reasons, and the employer's got a pretty free hand to say, no, we're returning to the workplace now. Sticking with the theme of employees who aren't happy to either work full-time in the workplace or they want to increase the number of hours that they work from home, the option for any employee at the moment is to put in a flexible working request. So remember, any employee can put in a request to vary their terms of employment, either in relation to hours or where they work from. And there's a process which an employer's got to follow in terms of dealing with that request. There are a variety of permissible reasons, generally business related, which an employer can rely on to reject the employee's request. There is a risk of a discrimination claim if a protected characteristic is involved. So again, if it is a woman who's saying, I want to work from home, I want to adjust my hours, then we need to consider the risks of an indirect discrimination claim. So that's the current situation in terms of asking for flexible working, but I think that that's likely to change. There's been quite a lot in the press over the last couple of weeks about the government's intentions. And the government has established a task force to advise the government in relation to flexible working. And the government is talking about putting forward proposals for consultation within the next 6 months, and including provisions in the new employment bill adjusting the right to request flexible working. I think the most significant ways in which they will seek to change things is that they will seek to introduce flexible working by default, i.e. making it an assumption that somebody should be allowed to work from home should they wish. And what's the best way of them doing that? Well, it's the obvious way is to make it more difficult for an employer to say no. So they may be looking at those reasons that an employer can rely on to say no, and they may be restricting those. And the other way in which the government is likely to change the arrangements is to introduce what they call non-contractual flexible working. So at the moment, flexible working requests are a bit cumbersome because what it does is it changes the terms of the contract. You can only make one request in a year, and it's inflexible in that sense. And the idea is that flexible working should be built into the arrangement without it being written into the contract of employment. So a greater level of flexibility. Let's look at the opposite scenario, and that is where the employer is wanting people to work from home, but individuals are reluctant to work from home. And one of the odd things, I suppose, from an employment lawyer's perspective over the last 18 months is that early last year, all of a sudden, a huge proportion of the workforce suddenly changed their place of work. And there was no discussion about, okay, well, what's this mean in terms of the contract of employment and what that says about the place of work? And does the employer have the right to require an employee to work from home? People just did it through a sense of cooperation and other reasons. And there was no real discussion about, well, what happens if an employer wants the employee to work from home, but the employee doesn't want to do that? They want to go into the workplace. Well, the first thing that an employer needs to do is have a look at the contract of employment. What does that say about where the employee can be required to work? Probably won't say that the employer can be required to work at home. So that will mean that an employer will need to try to secure an employee's agreement to work from home. Now, how might that agreement be secured? Well, the most obvious reasons why an employee has been willing to work from home is the question of job security, the threat of redundancy, the fact that the job no longer exists working in the office. So that is one incentive to an employee to agree to work from home. An employer can encourage the employee to agree by perhaps covering all of the costs associated with working from home and sharing some of the financial benefits to the employer associated with having more of the workforce working from home. If you can't get the employee's agreement, is an employer entitled to say, right, well, you are required to work from home? If it wants to go through that process, it's got to consider dismissing and re-engaging and taking on the risk of unfair dismissal claims. I think most employers, provided they've got sound business reasons to require the employee to work from home, perhaps they're shutting down offices or shutting down workplaces, and provided that they can show that they did their best to support the employees in the process, will be in a good position to defend an unfair dismissal claim. And similarly, there's the risk of a constructive dismissal claim if an employer doesn't go through the right processes of consultation in terms of trying to push the change through. Okay, let's assume that you've put in place home working arrangements. Let's just remind ourselves of some of the health and safety issues involved. General obligation on the employer exists under the Health and Safety at Work Act to take reasonable care of employees' safety, and that applies equally to home workers. So you've got the same considerations in terms of taking care of individuals' health and safety, whether they're working in the workplace or whether they're working at home. And the most obvious area will be in relation to workstations and the display screen equipment regulations, making sure that the workstation is safe. The primary focus there is on undertaking a risk assessment. So what you need to be doing, all employers need to be doing this, is making sure that they ask employees who work from home to undertake a workstation risk assessment and to help them to do that. And that will cover areas such as the equipment being used, the setup of that equipment, lighting, noise, temperature within the home working environment. Keep in mind, where you've got disabled staff, the same obligations in relation to reasonable adjustments apply. So if there's a piece of kit that you provide to a disabled employee within the workplace and you're asking them to work from home, or they are choosing to work from home, then the same obligation exists to provide that piece of kit. And keep in mind the risks in terms of lone working, including risks to physical safety, particularly where any individual who works from home is required to have any contact with third parties. There's one particular area which receives a lot of focus in terms of health and safety and working from home, and that's stress and mental health. So if we look at the next slide, we can see that Deloitte have provided some helpful analysis in relation to the extent of the problem. We can see it's on the rise. We can see it's costly to employers, and we can see the benefits of investment by employers on mental health in terms of how that improves presenteeism, reduces absenteeism and staff turnover. And then some other statistics in relation to mental health. It's estimated 75% of people with a diagnosable mental illness receive no treatment, and 1 in 4 people will suffer from mental health each year. So it does receive a lot of publicity now. It's great that it does. I mean, it's because it's a significant issue. So moving on to a poll, just to explore amongst you the extent of the and the way in which mental health has been impacted by working from home. So you can see there the options. It's had no impact. It's had no significant impact. That there has been sufficient impact to necessitate taking some action, and finally that there's been a serious impact. So I'll let you vote. Right, I'm not seeing any answers at the moment or any results.
It's a waiting game, Simon.
Yeah, well, here they are. Okay, well, this is quite interesting, and well, only 3% of you said that it's had no impact because there's been no home working. 33% say that there's been no significant impact on mental health as a result of home working. And then 63% are saying that it's had sufficient impact to necessitate taking some action. You know, that 63% is significant. You know, the fact that a lot of you are saying, yes, it is an issue, and yes, we are having to do something about it. Okay, so just moving on. You know, whether you're encouraging people back to the workplace or whether you're encouraging people to work from home, there are likely to be issues in relation to mental health. In terms of encouraging people back to work, it's going to be a big change. So here's a simple table to keep in mind when you're planning that process. The need for risk assessments, consultation with staff, make sure you take staff with you. Communication has to be excellent through HR managers and through staff surveys, etc. Then keep in mind the ways in which you can support staff in terms of mental health through this process of change. Okay, well, I'm going to hand back to Greg now to look at some of the broader impacts associated with these different ways of working.
Thanks, Simon. And I'm just looking through the questions. So we've got a number of questions already come through. And what I'll do is, there's some around the 4-day week, Simon, which I'll pick up at the end. And there's some which have been prompted by what you've just been through. So I'll leave you to read through those. And at the end, we'll, as I said at the start, we'll try and get through as many of those as we can. Okay, so I'm going to just talk about some of the broader impacts of these new working models, things which you've probably been thinking about already, and then we'll wrap up with your questions. So, you know, inevitably, the working culture as it is now in May of 2021 will be different to your working culture as it was in February of 2020. We're all in the same boat in that respect, but what's the culture and the values of the business going to be going forward, where you've got less face-to-face time? You know, you've got to try and onboard staff and articulate and embed the culture and your identity with those staff, especially the new joiners who won't have those existing relationships. They've got to try and understand and live the culture and values, and how are you going to make sure that you do that. Culture workshops are talked about as becoming more regularly used. Recognition schemes as well, other ways of embedding culture and values. But is this time to refresh your culture, to completely reset it? Certainly some businesses, it is a complete reset because everything's changed for them. Not everyone, but for some businesses, certainly that would be the case. And how do you ensure, when you've got some staff working in the office, some staff working in particular locations, and some people working from home to varying degrees dependent on their roles, how do you ensure they will get the same cultural experience? And these are questions which certainly lots of employers are grappling with at the moment. And from the research that I've read, and there's lots of stuff on the McKinsey website about these topics. You know, they're saying that the key for leaders is to make sure that you are open-minded and that you are malleable, and so you try things, and if they don't work in terms of resetting that culture and those values, that you change and that you try other things. And it's that flexibility and malleability, I think, which is going to be key to making sure that the culture and values going forward work effectively for your organisation. We've heard so much about productivity and the impact of home working on productivity. But what's clear is that it's unclear, in fact, how much impact home working has on productivity, for the better or for the worse. There's no clear evidence of that impact. There's lots of perceptions and lots of beliefs from employers, from employees, as to whether or not it adversely or positively impacts performance and productivity. So in terms of employer perceptions, 37% of employers think it has had no impact, home working. 22% think that productivity reduced slightly, and 18% think that productivity has increased slightly. And what's clear though, and this all comes from the CIPD report from last September, which I mentioned previously, is that the people-related factors have the biggest impact on productivity rather than technological factors, which may come as a little surprise. Let's ask you though. So a poll, what impact do you think working from home has on your staff's productivity? So it's might have reduced their productivity quite a lot, a little bit of a reduction, no impact at all, slightly more productive, and very much more productive. What do you think for your staff? I'm going to guess that slightly more productive might be the highest, but I may be wrong. There you go. Okay, so nearly a half if you think your staff are slightly more productive. Some, only 17% are saying negative impact on productivity, and a quarter saying it's been neutral. Of course, how do we measure it? We don't know. It's just a perception. Okay, thanks for that. Okay, and then just finally from me, some thoughts around performance management. You know, we are trying to manage and motivate our staff in a completely different way, because we have less face-to-face time. We have less seeing them to observe and coach and mentor them that we do when we're sat next to them potentially at a desk. So in terms of what you might think to do in terms of performance management and appraisal process, the first point is should line managers actually reset their baseline, by which I mean should their expectations be reset? Because if you are appraising someone as to what their performance has been like over the last 12 to 15 months, say, then your expectations as a line manager maybe should be reduced, because they've had all sorts of other issues, factors in their life that might have meant that their performance wouldn't be quite as high as it would do normally. You know, if they've been working from home, if they've been sharing childcare and juggling that, if they've had to isolate, all these factors may lead you to say to your line managers, well, look, guys, we need to reset our baseline. We need to lower our expectations and be more balanced. Share feedback in advance with the person being appraised. Well, something that I suppose one should always try and do, but not often is it the case. But certainly in this world where we're doing potentially online appraisals, must be useful and fair on staff to share feedback with them in advance. What about using software to help you with your appraisal process? Many of you will have HR software of some sort, and it may include a performance management appraisal system. But the advantage of using software where you use it to track performance over time, over the full 12 months that you're looking at, is it avoids what's called a recency effect, whereby a manager may just focus on the most recent 2, 3, 4 months, rather than having that complete picture of things over the whole year. And of course, what a software package can do is allow you to track it over a year if the manager updates it regularly in terms of the key events over the course of that 12-month period. So important for the manager, if they're doing it in a virtual environment, to pay attention to eye contact and body language, which one doesn't so easily see in a virtual environment. Pay attention to, and think about their interpersonal strengths, think about their emotional intelligence. How's that been demonstrated or brought to the fore, or not, as the case may be, over the course of the last 12 months. We all behave differently in a physical meeting, arguably, than we do when we're in a virtual online environment. So factor that in. And of course, you want your line managers to show plenty of empathy and support. And one way of doing that, of course, is for a line manager to be honest about their own struggles. Very few people, I'm sure this is right, very few people will say that they found the last 12, 14 months, a breeze, and it hasn't affected them in some way. So show that empathy, be honest about your own struggles as a manager, and that will potentially help the person to relax and be honest about their own perception. And of course, what may have also happened over the last 12 months is that their own personal goals may have changed. And that's something that one should build into the conversation, arguably as well, because they may be very much enjoying sitting on their veranda in somewhere hot and sunny. Well, not in Sussex, certainly, at the moment. Okay, all right, so there's just some thoughts there about the broader impacts of these new working models. So what I'll do, Simon, do you want to pick out one or two of the questions that sort of came from your slot, and then I'll do the same firstly on the 4-day week questions. But can I hand over to you for that?
Yeah, okay. Right, well, we've got plenty of questions. So I'm going to, Lisa McGuire's asked, where does one stand when employees with no pre-existing health issues have said they only feel comfortable return to the office once they're fully vaccinated? Their role could be done from home. So you've got an employee who's not keen on returning to the workplace. There's no pre-existing health issues. I think probably you're in a pretty strong position to say you need to return. If there's no pre-existing health issues, the risk of a Section 44, Section 100 claim are low. There's no disability-related issues. So the probability is that you'd be able to say you can be required to come into work, but tread carefully. There might be particularly powerful other reasons why an employee is reluctant. Robin Hall asks, can a mobility clause be used to require the employee to work from home? I'd say it's doubtful. I mean, if you've got, most mobility clauses will say something like you can be required to work at any of the company's locations, things like that. I've never ever seen a mobility clause which says you can be required to work from home. And I think an employee would be entitled to say, well, no, if I've got a clause which says I can work in a different office, different business location, that's one thing, but I can't be required to work from home against my will. But you then get to the next bit of the discussion, which might be, okay, well, you're saying you can't work from home, however, the office is closing, the office is shut, and potentially that's a redundancy situation. So the employee might be faced with a difficult choice of either losing their job or agreeing to work from home. Melinda Clement, stop me, Greg, when you feel that there's.
Do this one, Simon, then I'll do a couple, shall I?
Yeah, by all means. Melinda Clements asked, we've had situations where employees who are working from home and looking after children, it's difficult to assess how this affects performance, but employers are concerned about this. How should it be managed? That is a difficult one. I mean, I think the truth is that for most people who are working from home, home life does have an impact on how they work. And we have seen from the poll that there's some positive impacts in terms of productivity. but there are also some negative ones. And I think it is a situation where I would be advising employers to show some flexibility. I think that if you're asking employees to compromise in terms of what they do, where they work from, the hours that they work, etc., and an employee is asking for compromise in return, then I think as an employer you need to be accommodating. I suppose the simple answer also is you need to talk to the employee. You know, it's about understanding what the issues are, how you can support the employee, and how you can come to a situation which suits everybody.
Okay, so then a couple on 4-day weeks. So Isabel asks, how would you treat existing part-time workers in a move to a 4-day working week? Is there a proportionate reduction in working hours while maintaining pay? Well, the approach I would suggest, Isabel, is that you do treat them proportionately with full-timers. If you're moving to a 4-day week, and let's say your 4 days is either 32 hours a week or maybe more, then it'd be a proportionate reduction for part-timers, because then that would avoid any part-timers saying, well, they're being less favourably treated. So I would very much expect it to mirror the proportionate reduction that you would then have for the full-timers. And then Neil, again on the 4-day week, does this tend to be done via the company closing for that extra day per week, or having different people having a different additional day off per week? So the company remains open for 5 days. Well, it's going to depend on the business and the sector they're in. If, for example, it was a production operation, a manufacturing operation, and they're going to close for that 5th day and shut down the machines, for example, then they do it that way. But most service businesses certainly would probably do a 4-day week on the basis that they'll have some, let's say, working Monday to Thursday, some working Tuesday to Friday, and some doing others. So you've got full coverage over that 5 days. And the point with a 4-day week structure would be that it's for agreement with the staff. You would go and discuss it with them, and you'd come up with a structure that's going to work for you and it's going to work for your employees, hopefully. Because if you can't find something that's going to work for you, of course, you won't be able to do it. I guess would be the reality of it. Okay, thanks for those questions, Neil. And Isabel, Simon?
Okay, I'll have Janine Baker is asking, should employer liability insurance extend to working from home? And what are the employer obligations if an employee has an accident in their home working environment? Great question. Yes, I would, as an employer, contact my employer liability insurer to say, look, these are changed working arrangements. We've got a number of staff working from home. It's highly relevant to employers, to the insurer's decision in relation to insurance. So yes, I would tell the insurers. I would also suggest that you encourage your staff to tell their home insurers. Because again, I think the fact that somebody is working from home, doing different things in the home, spending more time at home is material to the question of insurance. I think you should be telling your staff to tell their home insurers. And what are the employer's obligations if an employee has an accident in their home working environment? Well, remember that an employer owes the same obligations in relation to health and safety. Remember about undertaking the workstation and the work environment risk assessment. So if you allow an employee to work from home in an environment where, for example, there are laptop leads that are lying all over the place, that are plugged in, people trip over, then there is a risk that the employer will be liable for that, because you have your responsibility to make sure the working environment is risk assessed and is reasonably safe. An employee suffers an accident working from home, which is unrelated to the working environment, then I don't think that there's a liability. What qualifies somebody as a home worker? Does it have to be full-time and dictated by the organisation? Or if I choose to work from home 1 day per week, do the same obligations apply? That's Hilary Hill asking that. There's no strict definition of home worker in that sense. The obligations apply to anybody who spends some time working from home. So if you're looking at health and safety again, well, the obligations apply to somebody who works 1 day a week from home as much as they do to somebody who works 4 days a week from home.
So, funnily enough, that question came up from a client recently, Hillary's question about the home worker, and on the HSE website, when I looked at it, there's no definition, as you say, of home worker. It's just someone who permanently or temporarily working from home. So that could be anyone working half a day or 4 days a week.
Yeah, exactly. Somebody's asked, is there an obligation to report accidents when they happen at home in the same way as they might in an office? I think the answer there is yes. You can imagine that if there was a series of similar accidents, then that begins to inform the employer what they should be doing. So if everybody's complaining about stiff necks from working from home, is there an issue in relation to the way in which people are being allowed to work and the support that they're being given in terms of their workstation at home? So I think, yes, important to report accidents at home. And then just coming to the last couple, can hybrid working be run via policy instead of a change to T's and C's? That, again, I think is a really good question. Susie Hunter asked that. Yes, it can. And I would encourage organisations. Greg and I were talking about this before we started. I think there's huge benefits to organisations if they can talk to staff about working from home or hybrid working, establish some acceptable ground rules to run it by policy and consensus, as opposed to using the contract of employment to dictate what happens. It's just a better way of managing staff.
Okay, Simon, I think what we'll do then, I think there's a couple more at the end there, but I think what we'll do, because of time, we do like to try and finish at 11. What we'll do is we'll wrap up the session there. As I said, the Q&A, we'll publish questions and answers in about 7 to 10 days of what's been raised today. So you will get an answer to your question. Thank you to those of you who have joined us. We've had over 100 on this webinar, which is a similar number to the last one. So it's a very popular topic. I mentioned about the overseas working, and hopefully you will have received information about our next webinar, which Adam Williams, who runs our business immigration team, partner in the team, he's running in partnership with Menzies about overseas working and allowing your staff to work overseas, which is, I suppose, the ultimate flexibility potentially. That's on the 8th of June. So you should have had details about that webinar. It's in the morning, around 9 o'clock start, I believe. But if you haven't had details and you want details, either email Simon or myself, and our details are there, or contact your usual contacts at DMH Stallard. On behalf of Simon and I, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been another great session, lots of difficult issues that people are grappling with in terms of this flexibility, and we'll sort of keep it on our radars over the coming months as we talk to you through the webinars and on an individual basis about what it means for your business. So thank you one and all, and have a good day.
Thanks very much.